So, colleagues and friends, I'm going to spend the next 20 minutes or so just taking you through what the climate policy landscape looks like in Australia at the moment. It's been a fairly exciting few months for those of you that are interested in climate change policy, which I suspect is all of you. And then I'm very happy to take questions for 10 minutes or so. And someone does need to crash tackle me to the ground at the 20-minute mark because I have a terrible habit of going over time, but I'll do my best. All right, so what has happened recently? Many of you will have seen that the Climate Change Authority provided its independent advice to the Australian government in relation to a sort of aspirational and ambitious climate policy target, which the Australian government accepted. So we now have sort of 4 targets that provide the ambition architecture, if you like, for climate and energy policy within it. So we've got obviously what was there before, which was the 43% below 2005 levels by 2030, which we're pretty close to meeting, or we'll probably meet. And I should have said at the beginning that I'm here in my capacity as an honorary professor at UQ rather than in my official capacity as chair of IRAC. Just a caveat. The other target that has been around for some time is obviously the 82% renewable energy generation by 2030 target. And then the new one is a commitment of 62 to 70% below 2005 levels by 2035. So that is a significant jump from 2030 to 2035, which will be pursued. And I'll go through the framework in which that will be pursued and hopefully achieved. And then the one that we all know is net zero by 2050, which was until very recently a bipartisan target, but is no more. So there are sort of 5 decarbonisation priorities that provide the pillars, if you like, for achieving those targets in the coming years. All of this, I suspect you're very familiar with, so I won't go through it, but the final one there, net removals scaled up, is the piece of the puzzle that the Emissions Reduction Assurance Committee fits into, right? So the ACCU scheme, as I'll come to, is essentially the carbon crediting arrangement that allows companies that are covered by the safeguard mechanism to offset emissions above their baseline. And of course, if they go below their baseline, they're able to generate what's called safeguard mechanism credits. And I'm happy to talk about that, but I'm conscious that you're all interested in renewable energy. Just to bring you up to speed on where we're up to, and this is from the very recently released net zero plan. We've got a long way to go, and we can thank the land sector for the progress that has been made to a very large extent. Right? So Australia's land sector is a net sink. And you can see the contribution that is making, and frankly, it will continue to make. But where the real energy and the shoulder to the wheel needs to happen is in everything above that. The way that happens is through a range of sort of policy interventions, financial interventions, the crediting scheme, which is the ACCU scheme. So this is a busy slide, but in my world, this is exactly what you would expect to see from a sort of a comprehensive policy landscape. You'll always have, in any comprehensive policy architecture, the sort of the plan that says this is where we're going, it's the direction of travel, and this is the level of aspiration and ambition that we have. So that's the Net Zero 2050 plan with the supporting sectoral plans, which have all now been released. You'll always have some money. You'll always have some money in a comprehensive climate policy framework, and that is essentially the Powering Australia plan, the $40 billion investment to modernise the electricity grid, boost energy performance, support electrification and the like, as well as an additional $17 billion to capture opportunities in hydrogen, critical minerals and the like. The capacity investment scheme would be another significant policy intervention that you would, some of you at least, would be actively engaged in, I'm sure. in terms of the sort of, if you like, the single most important intervention for managing and constraining greenhouse gas emissions at the moment, it is the safeguard mechanism. So in the absence of a carbon tax, we have a safeguard mechanism, which essentially it's legislated, and it sets declining limits on facilities that have a footprint over 100,000 tonnes of CO2 equivalent per year. And they're across a range of different sectors, as you could imagine, including the waste sector. So there's a handful, 3 or 4 landfills that have emissions more than 100,000 tonnes a year. And so they're captured under the safeguard mechanism as well. And as I said, essentially they've got their 4.9% declining baseline. If they exceed their baseline, they are required to buy either SMCs or ACCUs, and if they manage to bring their emissions down below their projected baseline, then they can generate their own safeguard mechanism credits. So it's legislated. It's kind of I would say it's sort of a stealth form of cap and trade. Cap your emissions and you can trade your way out of it should it be more cost effective for you to do so. Right? It relies, as you can appreciate, on having an enormous amount of confidence in that last pillar on the right, which is the ACCU scheme. And the role that the Emissions Reduction Assurance Committee that I chair plays is to provide assurance that each of the methods in the scheme have sufficient integrity so that we know when the ACCUs are issued, you're getting what it says on the tin. And at the moment there's 14 methods, and our job is really to review new methods, to review varied methods, to review current methods that we think might need to be reviewed. And we also provide advice to the Assistant Minister, Josh Wilson, in relation to new methods that ought to be supported for development. Now, they're the big pieces, and then you have the sector-specific policies that will fill in the gaps over time. And at the moment, you know, you'd be familiar with the new vehicle emission standards. I've mentioned the CIS. There's a future gas strategy, and it hasn't been released yet, but we know that the government has done, under Professor Frank Yotzo's leadership, a significant piece of work in relation to the potential need for a carbon border adjustment mechanism, a CBAM. So they're the key pillars, and this is what the electricity and energy sector plan looks like. Can I have a show of hands of who's read the sector plan? Okay, no one. That is your, oh, one person, fantastic. So, look, it is not policy prescriptive, right? It doesn't go into an enormous amount of detail that says by next Tuesday we're going to design and implement, you know, a specific policy to achieve X. It is not prescriptive in that way. But if you are interested in the direction of travel from a policy perspective, but more particularly from a research perspective of what's going to be needed from 2030, 2035 and beyond, it is always useful to read these documents because every word matters. Right? It looks like it's glossy, and often these documents can be mistaken for you know, just being brochures. But I can tell you from having worked on the inside now for a good few years that that actually every word is fought over. And it will really tell you where the direction of travel is going. So it's set up around 5 sort of pathways, if you like. One is to take a whole of system view, which you'll appreciate. The second is energy performance. Then third is electricity. 4 is gaseous fuels. And then 5 is obviously low carbon liquid fuels. I suspect none of that surprises you, but it is at least all encompassing. And I work in my job with people interested in low carbon liquid fuels, and certainly for them this has provided an enormous boost because they have felt for some time that they were sort of the neglected poor cousin, but they now have their own sort of pathway plus a $1.1 billion boost of funding announced recently. Very much a phased approach, and you will see that this phasing combined with the ambition that is 62 to 70% means that that period from now to 2035 will be intense. Right? There will be enormous opportunities, but also enormous pressure on the system as a whole to be able to deliver on that aspiration. So the first sort of push, which is a continuation of the last 4 or 5 years or so, will obviously be around the electrification of the economy as a whole, and very much trying to meet that 82% renewable energy target, and trying to seed demand in the domestic markets for renewable energy gas and low carbon liquid fuels. Now in my world, which is obviously the bit that I'm most familiar with, this looks like really trying to get biomethane from landfills taken up. Right? At the moment, what we tend to have is quite successful landfill gas method that has seen entities move beyond flaring to generation, but not necessarily going all the way to biomethane production. So you'll see that as these pillars are announced and then effort is put behind them, there is a genuine attempt to sort of push the dial, if you like, to achieve the targets, and it just gets more intense as we get closer to it. 2030 to 2035 is obviously electrification and energy efficiency, but really focusing around transport, the built environment and the industry sectors, which are sort of lagging, as we saw. And then renewable energy gas and low carbon liquid fuels, specifically for the hard to abate sectors like aviation. And I'm certainly not an expert on sustainable aviation fuel, but I know the Queensland government has put an enormous amount of effort into trying to figure out whether or not Queensland's ag sector, particularly cane could be a source of biomass for sustainable aviation fuels. But you're scientists and engineers, and you'll be much more across that. From an economic perspective, we're not there, would be my summary. 2035 to 2050 is abundant clean energy, economy-wide electrification, and firmed renewable energy generation. So we're already seeing enormous effort being put into the distribution of battery technology, particularly at the household level. Who here has taken advantage of the 30% rebate for household batteries? One. Wow. Do you not live here? Oh, fantastic. Sorry. Well, I'm preaching to the converted. Yeah. How many people have got batteries at home already? Okay, you didn't bowl me over with the number there. Yeah, I appreciate the effort. So that has been an enormously successful program already, with 100,000 household batteries already installed or signed up to be installed. And it was released like 3 or 4 months ago. 100,000 household batteries, and many more to come. And certainly in my conversations with colleagues in the Clean Energy Regulator, they pulled it together very quickly, and the system reacted very, very quickly, which is, there's demand there. I think there was probably a quiet concern in the background about whether or not this was sort of middle-class welfare. But in fact, the demographics of where those 100,000 have been deployed is actually quite heartening. Right? It's in outer suburbs that really recognise the financial benefit that can come from having that sort of small-scale firming capacity. Enabling the transformation is all the things on the right-hand side, and depending on where you are in this sort of research system, you will see yourself in one of the 6 or more than one of the 6. And again, I would urge you to read this document because you need to see yourself in it. You need to know where your research fits, because you need to be in a position to respond when each of those 6 are sort of given a push by the government, which will happen. Before I moved into government, I was an academic, and I was constantly shouting at the tent, and eventually decided that I should get into the tent to figure out what in God's name was going on in the tent. Because it seemed to be really quite weird. And now that I've been in the tent for a few years, I have a whole new appreciation for what this landscape means, right? Because there's actually internal pressures in the public administrative system to report against all of it, right? And that's the accountability framework, that we as citizens don't really think about except when we come to vote. But as a public servant, you really are genuinely going, okay, well, what have we done about developing supply chain security? Anybody? Anybody? What do we need to do? And that's where people like us as academics can sort of put our hands up and say, well, actually, we think you got this wrong and you ought to do that. And then in terms of recent developments, very recent developments, there's that 30% rebate I mentioned. There's the low carbon liquid fuels funding. The big one last week was the reforms to the EPPC Act. Does anyone want to hazard a guess what the big piece was in the EPPC Act reforms that is relevant to the electricity sector and this plan? It's about that enabling the transformation piece, right? It's about getting faster approvals for renewable energy rollout, right? So if you walked through all of last week and were vaguely aware of negotiations around Australia's only federal environment protection and biodiversity legislation, just be aware that it had profound implications for your sector and your areas of interest. And you need to watch this space in the coming 12 months because the implementation side of it will be where the interesting stuff happens and the rubber hits the road. And I'm mixing metaphors as usual, but you get the point. ARENA grants will be familiar to all of you. And then, of course, there's the rollout of EV charging networks. And, there's things that I'm not super familiar with, but there's pilot programs in relation to vehicle-to-grid charging that are being rolled out. Again, don't ignore the opportunity to comment on the pilots that are undertaken for different technologies and the deployment thereof, because that will be where your expertise really shines to help governments understand what their next intervention needs to be vis-a-vis standards. Boring, so boring. There is nothing more boring than standards, and yet they underpin everything. And in my experience, it's often the scientists and engineers who find a problem well before anybody in my part of the world thinks about it. Look at that, 21 minutes. I'm a legend. Does anyone have any questions? Comments, feedback, gratuitous praise? I take it all, the man in white.
Thanks, Karen. I was very interested in your passing comment on the safeguard mechanism being a de facto cap and trade scheme. From inside the tent, can you comment on whether that was a stroke of genius from the government to get that through and have no one actually jump on it and say, that's a price on carbon, that's bad? I mean, how did they do it?
Yes, I'm conscious this is being recorded, so if you could make sure that doesn't get out, that would be useful. So it was introduced by the previous government, LNP government, and I don't know whether it was deliberate or not, but I think it was a stroke of genius to design it as a mechanism that could be ratcheted up in two ways: coverage and the gradient for the baseline. Right?
And because it was the previous government's policy, the previous government
they couldn't
complain about it.
Yeah.
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 But did the previous government, when they put that mechanism into the safeguard, ever anticipated it being used like this, with ratcheting it down by 4.9% per year?
I don't know, genuinely don't know. I think Greg Hunt might have been the minister at the time, and he was certainly, of quite a number of the ministers at the time, he was very keen to do something meaningful on climate change, so it's distinctly possible. And so the other thing to keep an eye on is next year the safeguard mechanism will be reviewed. Right? And those of you with expertise should really weigh in because they're going to need to rely on that mechanism. It captures about, I think, 30% of emissions at the moment, which is pretty awesome for a single intervention. But they're going to need to think about whether or not they can either drop the threshold and therefore capture more entities, or expand the coverage, the sectoral coverage, or change the baseline, or all of the above or none. Chap at the back.
No, it's the chap at the front, actually.
Sorry, chap on the left.
Just to confuse you. So thank you very much for that. I always like hearing policy talks. You know, they're always interesting. So on your slide, you had the agriculture, and which I presume also includes forestry, gives you a -16% in terms of
Yeah, it's land use change.
the emissions. But the whole concept of net zero implies there has to be a negative somewhere if there is a positive somewhere else.
Yep.
And so how much positive, so if you just assume that everything went electric in terms of, you know, houses and, you know, cars and everything else, do you have a feel of what that agricultural abatement would need to be to deal with the things that can't actually stop emitting?
Yeah, yeah. So the Treasury modelling from memory had the residual emissions at 2050 still being between 167 and 168 million tonnes. So that's your negative emissions that need to be accounted for. And the ag sector is going to be relied on enormously to deliver on that. And to be fair to the ag sector as a whole, they genuinely are, you know, sort of being looked to deliver a lot of those negative emissions. And I think the ACCU scheme is going to continue to play an increasingly important role in that. And they're looking at the soil organic carbon method, the savanna fire management method, the integrated farm and land management method, which isn't a thing yet, but will be, hopefully. So the short answer is the ag sector is being asked to do a lot of the heavy lifting just in relation to that sink piece. In terms of practice change, I think the real opportunity around methane emissions from the ag sector is obviously in feed additives. You know, I don't think the science is certainly emerging. It's very promising. There's a number of technologies that are being piloted in trials. But I would anticipate that in the next few years, there'll be a real push to see feed additives rolled out. Yeah. But the ag sector will be asked to do a lot more than just that. And then they need to decide whether they're insetting or offsetting. And which is, as you know, a whole sort of debate, and landholders will need to be, you know, really aware of the risks and opportunities.
Great. Question here.
Just want to ask about the role of National Reconstruction Fund in all these policies.
The National Reconstruction Fund. Is this the 15 billion that's led by Martijn Wilders? Is it related to the Future Made in Australia fund? Is it the same one? Yes? Okay. So my understanding is that there are very specific legislative parameters around how that money can be invested in terms of what types of technologies. And I'm clearly not that familiar with it, but certainly in my conversations early on with the head of that, it was about being able to provide some domestic subsidisation for the deployment of technologies that are not yet economic and commercial, but with a bit of a boost could be, which is not controversial in my view. As an economist, we do that, you know, that's what you do, right? Is you identify areas that are prospective and that will deliver on your overarching goals and that you were voted in to achieve, and that 15 billion is there to do that. Where the sectors are, you'd need to go to the legislation or the website and just find out.
We've got a question up in the back. Andrew Blakers.
So I'm from ANU.
Hello, Andrew.
Hello, Karen. There have been scathing reviews of the Chubb report by extremely prominent scientists. It just seems to me to be almost unanimous that a large fraction of the land use negative emissions is fictitious. So how are these being addressed? I don't see any evidence that these views from people who know better than anybody are being taken seriously. Perhaps they are, but there's no in the open evidence that these so-called carbon sinks are actually being investigated to produce high-quality peer-reviewed papers that say, yes, they're okay, or no, they're not.
Yeah. Thank you, Andrew. Nice, easy one to end with. So the short answer is I am confident and can see that there have been a range of mechanisms taken up and deployed since the Chubb review to test and ground truth and or provide further assurance that the methods themselves have, and the projects that come out of them have integrity. There are a few things that I would say, right? So the gateway reviews that have been done by Associate Professor Chris Brack, also from ANU, give us some assurance in relation to the human-induced regeneration method. I would stress that my committee has no role in any assurance in relation to that as an expired method. So I personally, with my committee, we have no. It's an expired method, right? And we deal with current or proposed new methods. I came into the role probably quite anxious about what I was going to be dealing with. And 2 years into the role, I can say that the governance architecture and framework, at least, I think will deliver a lot more confidence in the years to come. How do I know that? The powers of the Emissions Reduction Assurance Committee, as opposed to the Clean Energy Regulator, are related to the methods. The Clean Energy Regulator is related to the projects themselves, but I'll speak to the ERAC. So we are required to review methods that we think have a need for review, right? Because we're concerned in one way or another that they don't comply with one or more of the 6 offsets integrity standards. In and of itself, that gives us an opportunity to be able to sort of dig into the weeds and see whether or not we're confident with the science that underpins each of the methods. On occasion, when we are satisfied that we have reasonable evidence to suggest that the method no longer complies with one or more of the offsets integrity standards, we have the power to press pause and to suspend the processing of applications against that method. Now, interestingly, that power had never been used until last year, right? When we used it to press pause while we had a good hard look at the beef cattle herd management method. And as it turns out, our conclusion was that it didn't comply with at least one of the offsets integrity standards. So that is a sort of a function, a statutory power that enables us to do the job that needs to be done. Right? Another example would be, at the moment, we're reviewing the soil organic carbon method. Now, to be honest, the trigger for that was actually a proponent-led method development process that ran last year, and there were lots of good ideas about how the method could be improved. So we said we were going to review the method on that basis, and then some work came out from QUT and a number of highly respected authors that questioned whether or not the method was consistent with the offsets integrity standards. And so now we're digging into the method to make sure that we have confidence. So Andrew, I think that there is absolutely a need for every part of this system, including but not limited to the ERAC, to be alive always to compliance with the offsets integrity standards and use all of their powers to be able to provide that assurance. And I think the Chubb review, if nothing else, put an enormous amount of scrutiny on the scheme and consequently bodies like mine to do our jobs to the best possible, as best as we can. And the Clean Energy Regulator is obviously critical to that as well. So I'm confident that in the overwhelming majority of cases, the projects that are given ACCUs are given legitimate and genuine ACCUs. Do I think all projects are going to be successful all of the time? Absolutely not. Why? Because we're talking about the land sector. It is highly variable, highly dynamic. We don't have all the answers. That's particularly true with soil organic carbon. And so the onus is on us to use the powers that are available and adopt a continuous improvement sort of mentality, if you like. And that, I think, is what the Chubb Review delivered.
Okay, we'll have to wrap it up. I'm sure there are more questions. Will you be here for morning tea? Excellent. Thank you so much, Karen. It was, I think, very, very useful to have someone remind us that the work we're doing really needs to go and inform policy. So make sure we're watching the sector plan. I'll go ahead and read it, and think about how the research we're doing can actually have the most impact in the real world. So please join me in thanking Professor Karen Hussey.